Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're tackling a huge topic, one of the most sacred and, let's be honest, contested sites in all of history. We're talking about the first temple of Jerusalem, Solomon's temple. Okay, so the story of King Solomon's magnificent temple, it's a cornerstone of faith and history for literally millions of people. But what if that story isn't exactly true? What if it's more myth than history? Well, we're going to dive into a really provocative argument from one source that claims exactly that. Let's break down how they build their case. So the source we're looking at today, this YouTube video, doesn't just question some details. It challenges the very existence of the temple. We're going to walk through their specific claims and really focus on how they use textual analysis and theological arguments to push back against the story we all think we know. All right, so where does this argument even start? Well, the source turns first to the Qur'an. It looks at what the Islamic text says about King Solomon's big building projects and, what it doesn't say. And that omission, that's the real key to their first major point. So here's the interesting thing. The source points out that the Qur'an talks all about Solomon's amazing architectural feats, right? Like this incredible glass palace that just blew the Queen of Sheba away. But it never once mentions a big building specifically called the Temple. And according to this source, that silence is deafening. And this brings us to the core question the source is asking. It's basically an argument from silence. Their logic goes something like this. If the Quran takes the time to mention what seem like pretty small details, Solomon's chats with ants, then why on earth would it leave out a building of such huge religious importance? They argue it's not just some random oversight. To them, it's proof that the temple just wasn't part of the original story. Okay, so after laying out its case based on the Quran, the source then pivots. It shifts its focus to critique of very texts that are the foundation for the whole temple story, the biblical accounts. And here's their central claim. The biblical books describing the temple, they're not perfect divine revelations. Instead, they're human writings. And like any human writing, they can have errors and changes. The source says the proof is right there in the text, and what they call clear internal contradictions. And this is a perfect example of what they're talking about. The source zooms in on this kind of discrepancy. So one book says there were 3,300 supervisors for the temple, but another says 3,600. For the source, this difference isn't a small typo. It's evidence that these are, flawed historical accounts, not some perfectly preserved, unchanging record. But the critique doesn't stop with just a few numbers. It actually digs deeper into the sheer scale of the whole operation. We're talking about the resources that were supposedly used to build the temple. And the source argues that these numbers are so huge, they defy logic and feel more like something out of a myth. Okay, get this. 100,000 talents of gold. The source puts that number front and center, calling it a completely fantastical amount for any ancient building project. It just drains all belief. And this single figure becomes a real cornerstone of their argument that, hey, maybe this story is more legend than fact. And believe me, it doesn't stop with the gold. The scale just gets bigger and bigger. The source points to accounts that mention over 180,000 workers, 1 million talents of silver, and so much iron and bronze that they didn't even bother to weigh it. So they lay out all these figures to make one simple point. These numbers have to be wildly exaggerated. So here's where it all comes together, according to the source. You've got this fundamental mismatch. On one hand, you have this absolutely unbelievable amount of workers and treasure. On the other hand, what did they build? A structure that's roughly 30 by 10 meters. That's like a modern multi-story building, but not a sprawling complex. The source argues that this huge gap between the resources and the result just doesn't add up. And for them, it points to the story being made up. All right, so the source has analyzed ancient texts, but now it makes a huge pivot into a very modern and very political argument. The claim is that this whole story about the temple doesn't just exist in some history book. Nope. It serves a very specific, very real modern-day purpose. So this is how the source lays out its political theory. They argue that the story of the temple wasn't this continuous memory passed down through generations. Instead, they claim the story was basically forgotten for centuries. And then, it was strategically brought back to life in the 19th century. And why? To create a historical and religious reason for a return to Jerusalem. And this is where the source makes its most direct and, frankly, most provocative claim. It alleges that promoting the temple story today
isn't really about ancient history at all. They say it's driven by a goal to remove the Al-Aqsa Mosque in order to build a third temple in its place.
So let's wrap up the argument we've been exploring from this one source. Essentially, they completely reframe the story of the temple. It's not about a lost piece of religious history. Instead, they present it as a carefully built political myth, one designed specifically to create a legitimate claim on Jerusalem today.
So, as we've seen through the lens of this one particular source, how we interpret a story about an ancient building is, well, it's way more than just a historical debate, isn't it? This viewpoint connects it directly to some of the most difficult conflicts we see today. It really makes you think about the incredible power these old stories have to shape our modern world, and how a single narrative can be a foundation of faith for millions, a hot topic for scholars, and a political flashpoint, all at the very same time.